In 2024, as a result of not reaching their sales goals, Square Enix announced that they could no longer afford to have their games be exclusive to one platform. Of course, this would mean that the Final Fantasy mainline games would return to the Xbox ecosystem. At face value, this really does make sense. More potential customers mean more potential sales, but context is everything here. So for perspective, we need to look at why the franchise originally left the Xbox ecosystem in the first place. Okay, before we move on with the video, I just want to take a moment to let everyone know that the monthly giveaway for July 2025 will be the PlayStation 5 Collector Edition version of Namco's Shadow Labyrinth. This is basically a Pac-Man game with a Metroidvania dressing. For anyone that wants to take part in any of our monthly or weekly giveaways, just subscribe to our YouTube, Twitch, Reddit, or website and leave a comment. The weekly winners are chosen every Saturday at the end of the week. Monthly winners are revealed on the final day of the month. For more information, head over to our website. Now, back to the video. Back at E3 2006, a new Final Fantasy project was announced, tentatively and collectively known as the Fabula Nova Crystallis project. This was a series of Final Fantasy games that were meant to be tied up in one single, cohesive, expansive universe. The games that would make up this world were Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII Versus, and lastly, Final Fantasy Akito 13. Now at the time, this new Final Fantasy universe that was announced was meant to be exclusive to the PlayStation 3. And for a long time, that was the belief. But development had become too much to handle. Final Fantasy XIII Versus was initially put on hold, and Akito 13 was put in limbo. This left the original Final Fantasy XIII as the sole survivor of the Fabula Nova Crystallis project. Now, after the initial release of the Final Fantasy XIII game on PlayStation 3, then Square Enix president Yoichi Wada said that Square Enix would develop games for the Xbox if they had merit. And lastly, at the end of Microsoft's E3 2008 presentation, Final Fantasy XIII was shown. Now from this point onward, Square Enix put effort into bringing the legendary franchise to the Xbox ecosystem. The full slate of the Final Fantasy XIII franchise was made available to both PlayStation and Xbox simultaneously from here on out. Final Fantasy Type 0, formerly known as Akito 13, and Final Fantasy 15, formerly known as Final Fantasy XIII Versus, were both shared between the two platforms as well. However, things clearly weren't as fun as rainbows being multi-platform as most would have you believe. In totality, the numbers for the Final Fantasy franchise on Xbox weren't even remotely close to the PlayStation counterpart sales. As a result, this may or may not have begun the fraying of the relationship between Square and Xbox. Now I can't say that for sure, that's just my own personal assumption and speculation, so don't quote that as gospel. Regardless, the end result was Square Enix taking a deal from Sony to once again make the mainline games exclusive to the PlayStation ecosystem. And that led to what happened next. Final Fantasy VII Remake. The original Final Fantasy VII was the game that helped put PlayStation on the map, as well as opened doors to other companies bringing their JRPGs over to the West. Prior to that, the genre really only had a select few games released beyond Japan's shores. And when Final Fantasy Remake was announced for the PlayStation 4 as an exclusive, the industry shockwave was massive. Thus began a short wave of Final Fantasy games exclusive to the PlayStation ecosystem. At least they were for a time. Next, when the PlayStation 5 released, a new, updated version of Final Fantasy VII Remake, complete with extra content, was released. Then came Final Fantasy XVI in 2023, a game Sony themselves helped Square Enix develop. And lastly thus far, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in 2024. These games having exclusive deals with PlayStation did help bolster Sony's brand. However, the sales didn't really please Square Enix all that much. Now, while these games did sell well, they actually did fall short of Square Enix's own internal projections. Now, a number of things can be at fault here. The fiscal climate, the lack of PlayStation 5s out in the wild at that time in households. Heck, it could be even the franchise straying too far from what it originally was, turn-based. Now, regardless of the reason or the rationale, the bottom line is, Square Enix felt that the numbers really weren't all that up to snuff. Now, here is where Square Enix may begin to remember why they went exclusive with Final Fantasy mainline games in the first place. Final Fantasy 16 released on the Xbox Digital Store on June 8, 2025. Now, when I first saw the Xbox Most Played list, Final Fantasy 16 was ranking at 431, and as of right now, it's out of the rankings completely. Mind you, this game both entered and fell out of the rankings in the same month on the Xbox ecosystem. Now, of course, the rankings can always change. They've done so in the past. But as of right now, that's where it stands. The game isn't ranked at all. Now, this highlights a few problems. The first problem is that the Xbox fanbase simply doesn't have enough people to support this game that actually care about it, thus the poor showing. This is a big reason why Square initially made that deal with Sony in the first place. And to get the elephant out of the room, yeah, we all know Final Fantasy 16 is an older game, but that excuse really doesn't hold up anymore. When you consider games like Sea of Thieves or Forza Horizon are either just as old or older, and when they hit the PlayStation 5, they managed to chart highly. So a game being old no longer is an excuse, especially when it's an industry heavy hitter. Now, the bigger issue is how Microsoft has basically conditioned their audience to not buy games and instead want them on Game Pass. If Square Enix didn't like the results of Final Fantasy 13 back when it was on Xbox before Game Pass existed, they should have at least some idea or analysis of what the series may or may not look like now that Game Pass exists. Okay, try to imagine this scenario. Final Fantasy 17 comes out for everything: PlayStation, Nintendo, personal computer, Xbox. Now, the cost of game creation is still high, so each platform has to make a certain amount to give Square Enix a return on their investment. Out of all the platforms, Xbox is the only one where you can make a legitimate case where it won't really sell well, and that's regardless of whether or not the game is actually good or not. The only way that it might be profitable is if Microsoft pays for it to be on Game Pass to make up for the actual lack of sales, and that's if Microsoft or Square Enix sees the game as being worth putting on Game Pass day one. From Microsoft's end, they know the franchise doesn't really move many units or boost many player numbers for the Xbox, so it's not impossible for them to come to the conclusion that it's not worth paying for Final Fantasy 17 day one. Developers have already stated that Microsoft's checks for Game Pass aren't as big as they were in the early days of the service. In Square Enix's case, in terms of optics and maybe sales, being on Game Pass day one might actually do more harm than good. Final Fantasy is considered a flagship franchise in the industry. It's certainly Square Enix's top IP. Optics-wise, it may make Square Enix look weak. Sales-wise, the game was more than likely going to do poor even if Game Pass didn't exist. Just look at Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy 15 for proof of that. But now with Game Pass, the Xbox audience is basically conditioned to not really buy anything, and that just magnifies the problem. Take note, look across the internet, see the comments for yourselves. I'll wait for it to hit Game Pass. If it's not on Game Pass, I'll pass. There are plenty of comments just like that all across the internet. Something that came to mind for me personally is whether or not Final Fantasy 16 on Game Pass was even in discussion to start with. Sure enough, Square had to know that sales would be bad, So why not put the game on the service? Could it be that Square was so desperate for sales that they just simply took a chance regardless of how bleak it would look? Or could it be that Microsoft knows their consumer base and they felt that paying the fee simply wasn't worth it? Now for Square's sake, I hope it's the former. Because if it is the latter, that can give the impression that the platform partner doesn't value their top franchise. Now that's just me speculating, so don't take that as gospel. But it is curious that the game isn't on the service. It's also only a matter of time before the mainline series returns to Nintendo's ecosystem. And with that, it's almost guaranteed to perform better there than it ever did on Microsoft's ecosystem. And that actually makes the situation even more glaring. When you look at the situation as a whole, there are questions both Square Enix and Microsoft have to ask themselves. If you're Square Enix, if Nintendo or Sony aren't willing to help with development or capital, is it worth bringing Final Fantasy to the Xbox in the future? After all, if Microsoft didn't really see the value in putting Final Fantasy 16 on Game Pass, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't really care about actually funding development either. And if you're Microsoft, when you see how dismally the game performed on your system, is it really worth bringing to your platform just for the sake of saying we have it too? And that's even with Game Pass. That's compounded by the fact that Sony won't help with development this time around since it won't be exclusive. And it's almost a surefire bet that Nintendo won't help for that same exact reason. Sure enough, that adds to Square Enix's costs. With the rising cost of development combined with the Xbox dismal showing, if Final Fantasy VII doesn't pull at least half decent numbers, we can very well see Square Enix going back to being exclusive with deals again. That could be Sony or Nintendo. Heck, it's not even out of the realm of possibility that they can leave Xbox out altogether. Either way, as of right now, don't be all that shocked if 2025's results don't push Square Enix back to being exclusive. They've already done it before. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. By all means, if anyone wants to chime in, leave a comment. Thanks for your time and take care.